good old reparations. Because there's nothing quite like making someone who's never owned slaves pay someone that's never been a slave. A congressional hearing erupted when Quillette writer Coleman Hughes trashed a bill to study slavery reparations as, quote, a moral and political mistake, forcing the chair of the hearing to tell the audience to chill. The House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties held a hearing Wednesday entitled H.R. 40 and the Push to Restorative Justice, at which witnesses testified about reparations for slavery. H.R. 40 is a bill which proposes a commission to study reparations. So they've hired a commission at taxpayer expense to figure out if people who've never owned slaves should fork over some cheddar to people who've never been slaves. Makes a whole lot of sense. Republicans, of course, are loving Hughes and want him to come over to their side, while Democrats continue to deride him for trying to maintain a semblance of balance. But as always, neither side can accurately put their finger on what's actually being said here. Hughes testified for the minority and delivered a lengthy opening statement against the bill in question.
With slave labor, and because of the work of Representatives Jesse Jackson Jr. and Zach Wamp, the new visitor center is named Emancipation Hall in that recognition.
And two-faced Washington bureaucrats love memorialized names and statues and artifacts because supporting things like Emancipation Hall makes them look good in the eyes of the gullible through mere verbal assent. Doesn't cost them anything.
Mr. Coleman Hughes is a columnist for Quillette and has worked as a freelance opinion writer since January 2018. He's had pieces published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, the City Journal, and the Spectator. He's studying philosophy at Columbia University, and we appreciate your attendance, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee.
Even though this guy is an avowed liberal, if you've read any of his articles, he shows himself to be open to the reasons and opinions of others who reject what he says.
It's an honor to testify on a topic as important as this one. Nothing I'm about to say is meant to minimize the horror and brutality of slavery and Jim Crow. Racism is a bloody stain on this country's history, and I consider our failure to pay reparations directly to freed slaves after the Civil War to be one of the greatest injustices ever perpetrated by the U.S. government.
Holding someone against their will and without their consent is the very definition of slavery, and it takes many forms. All prisoners are slaves. Anyone who's made to submit to the laws of politicians is a slave. And as we can see, slavery does not necessitate that someone have shackles around their wrists and their feet.
But I worry that our desire to fix the past compromises our ability to fix the present. Think about what we're doing today. We're spending our time debating a bill that mentions slavery 25 times, but incarceration only once, in an era with no black slaves, but nearly 1 million black prisoners.
And a lot of these prisoners are there simply for possessing something the ruling class or the master class has said you shouldn't own, like a plant.
A bill that doesn't mention homicide once, at a time when the Center for Disease Control reports homicide as the #1 cause of death for young black men. I'm not saying that acknowledging history doesn't matter. It does. I'm saying there's a difference between acknowledging history and allowing history to distract us from the problems we face today.
That seems pretty reasonable to me.
In 2008, the House of Representatives formally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. In 2009, the Senate did the same. Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care.
Actually, what black people and all people need is for government to back off and leave us the hell alone.
And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. Nearly everyone close to me.
Here's what's happening as Coleman speaks. His own brothers and sisters are rejecting what he's saying as he fights for their dignity as people, but all they care about is the money.
Nearly everyone close to me told me not to testify today. They told me that even though I've only ever voted for Democrats, I'd be perceived as a Republican and therefore hated by half the country.
In other words, don't speak the truth because people will hate you when you do that. There's no doubt he's now going to experience the wrath of the tolerant left. But hats off to him for being honest and courageous.
Others told me that by distancing myself from Republicans, I would end up angering the other half of the country. And the sad truth is that they were both right. That's how suspicious we've become of one another. That's how divided we are as a nation.
And that's the result of the left versus right paradigm lie that's woven itself into the fabric of our society. Politics is, by its very nature, polarizing because both sides rest on the shifting sands of immorality, and while the elites throw both sides scraps every once in a while, it's always a huge net positive for those pulling the levers of power.
If we were to pay reparations today, we would only divide the country further, making it harder to build the political coalitions required to solve the problems facing Black people today. We would insult many Black Americans by putting a price on the suffering of their ancestors. And we would turn the relationship between Black Americans and white Americans from a coalition into a transaction, from a union between citizens into a lawsuit between plaintiffs and defendants.
This citizenship idea is steeped in corporate personhood. Guys, we are not citizens of particular nations. We are people of the world. Human beings with the same right to live and be free as the next person.
What we should do is pay reparations to Black Americans who actually grew up under Jim Crow and were directly harmed by second-class citizenship, people like my grandparents.
The problem is, where does all that reparation money still come from? It comes from people who had nothing to do with enslaving another person. So what he proposes is still an injustice.
But paying reparations to all descendants of slaves is a mistake. Take me, for example. I was born 3 decades after the end of Jim Crow into a privileged household in the suburbs.
Oops, basically he's saying he had Black privilege. There are a lot of people out there who aren't going to like hearing that.
I attend an Ivy League school. Yet I'm also descended from slaves who worked on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. So reparations for slavery would allocate federal resources to me, but not to an American with the wrong ancestry, even if that person is living paycheck to paycheck and working multiple jobs to support a family. You might call that justice. I call it justice for the dead at the price of justice for the living.
But it's actually neither justice for the dead nor the living, because a corrupt government would extort resources to make another group dependent on their fake benevolence. People need to understand what reparations really are. They're nothing more than a form of welfare to keep Blacks dependent on government. That's it.
I understand that reparations are about what people are owed, regardless of how well they're doing. I understand that. But the people who are owed for slavery are no longer here, and we're not entitled to collect on their debts.
This is actually an outstanding point. But because he's caught up in the dog and pony show lie, he fails to see that taxation, for whatever reason, is the plundering of a person's resources without their consent.
Reparations, by definition, are only given to victims. So the moment you give me reparations, you've made me into a victim without my consent. Not just that, you've made 1/3 of Black Americans who poll against reparations into victims without their consent.
How about by nature of something based on natural law, not fictitious, man-made so-called citizenship? How about based on the fact that we're all human beings who don't have the right to harm another human being in order to pay reparations to others?
And Black Americans have fought too long for the right to define themselves, to be spoken for in such a condescending manner. The question is not what America owes me by virtue of my ancestry. The question is what all Americans owe each other by virtue of being citizens of the same nation. And the obligation of citizenship is not transactional. It's not contingent on ancestry. It never expires, and it can't be paid off.
Citizenship is a false concept hatched by delusional power grabbers, written into law by political parasites, and enforced by policy enforcers. The reason we're even talking about something as silly as reparations is because people imagine that there's a legitimacy in those who claim to be agents of government. Guys, government is slavery, and we're all victims of that system. Everyone in this hearing and those watching this hearing is a slave to one degree or another. And while what Coleman is saying has some good points, the waters of freedom are muddied by the political jargon of deranged psychopaths.
For all these reasons, Bill H.R. 40 is a moral and political mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Chill. He was presumptive, but he still has a right to speak. Mr. Burgess Owens is recognized.
People like Cohen here are behind identity politics that makes races hate one another. Besides, presumptive? I'd say taking a bucket of KFC and a rubber chicken to the House floor is pretty presumptive to me. But can you imagine getting booed by people about whom you just basically said have dignity and honor and don't want to be treated as weak, helpless, useless victims? What do you think about Coleman Hughes' testimony? Leave your thoughts about this in the comments section below. If you guys enjoy these videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, give it a thumbs up, and share it with everybody you know. Also, check out over 100 hard-hitting designs in the shirt store, and if you want to support more content, hit me up on Patreon or PayPal. All those links will be in the description and in the pinned comment. I'll see you guys in the next heavily censored shadow ban video.